Hey guys, in the last lesson we looked at four valid argument forms, or in other words, four arguments in which the conclusion necessarily follows from the premises regardless of the content because of an overarching form. We're going to do the same thing today. We're going to look at four more valid deductive argument forms. And provided that you understand validity and the idea of an argument form, this should be relatively simple. So the first one we're going to look at today, I'll go through the form first and then put the name after, so we're kind of working through it together. Starts with a disjunction as the first premise. And I'll put it lower down actually. So we say P or Q, right? Something or something else. There's two options. The second premise we say, all right, well, if P, then R, right? So if the first variable happens, then this certain consequent will follow. Then the third premise we say, if Q, then there's a different consequent that might follow. So either P or Q, if P then R, if Q then S. The question is, what conclusion necessarily follows from this? Well, let's look at it. There are two options, right? You know that from the first premise. If the first option happens, then this second thing follows. If the second thing happens, then this other thing follows. So if that's the case, the conclusion must be R or S. Why? Because if P or Q is happening, and if P and Q both have consequents, then one of those two consequents must follow. Now when you have this argument form, it is called a constructive dilemma, right? Or CD for short, if you want to just abbreviate it. Dilemma because there's a dichotomy, right, in the first premise, and it's constructive because you are constructing some important information from the fact that there's this binary where each of the variables have a given consequent. So let's put this into, let's put some content in here so that maybe it makes more sense. We are either going to New York to see, I don't know, insert band, Pink Floyd, right? Let's pretend it's the 70s. We're either going to New York, forget about the band, or we're going to Columbus. If we go to New York, we're seeing Pink Floyd. If we go to Columbus, we're seeing Led Zeppelin. Therefore, we're either seeing Pink Floyd or Led Zeppelin, right? Or we're either going to Bill's house or we're going out to eat. If we go to Bill's house, we're going to have a book club meeting. If we go out to eat, we're going to get a pizza. So either we're having a book club meeting or we're getting pizza. That's basically the idea of a constructive dilemma. Another way to easily remember this form, it's the only one we're looking at that has three premises. Think about it. Modus ponens, modus tollens, what else do we do? Hypothetical syllogism, all of that stuff only has two premises, right? This one has three. We're also going to be looking at ones today that only have one premise, but this is an easy way to remember it. It's the only form that we're looking at in class that has three premises. And that's about it for constructive dilemma. Next up, we have an interesting one. The first premise asserts P. The second premise asserts Q. What follows from that? Now, you might be inclined to say, oh, P or Q. No, we're not saying one or we're saying definitely P, definitely Q. Now, in order to understand this, we might want to take a step back and look at the types of claims we talked about, right? The functional types, the structural types. Remember, there was these certain statements that were either or statements, and we called them disjunctions. There are certain ones that were if then, and we called those conditional statements. And then there were ones that were and, but, yet. We call those conjunctions, right? Well, this proof conjoins the two asserted variables into one claim. So if P is the case, and if Q is the case, you can then make the claim that P and Q as one thing. So I know in class, we've been saying that you want to break down a claim into its simplest form, and that's true. So if you say, I went to her house last night and we sat and stayed up all night, right? Like, I went to her house last night is one claim. We stayed up all night, right? Something like that. So if both of those claims are true by themselves, then they're going to be true together. I went to her house last night and we stayed up all night talking. And that's why this proof, or this form, let's say, is called conjunction, right? Or conj. Why? Because you're conjoining two variables. You are making a conjunction out of two independent variables, right? And I don't mean that in like the scientific sense. I just mean you're taking two things that are true in their own claim and putting them together into one conjunctive claim, right? Into one conjunctive statement. And that necessarily follows, right? If P and Q were the case, this couldn't not follow. Like, it'd be logically impossible, right? It'd be metaphysically impossible for that conclusion not to follow. I like orange. I like red. Therefore, I like red and orange, right? If those two things are true, asserted as one, then they're going to be true, asserted as a pair, let's say. The third one we're going to be looking at is kind of the opposite of conjunction in a way. So the first premise is P and Q. Let's say that's the only premise. I'm sorry that the marker is not dark, by the way. I'll have to get some new ones. Remember, I said we're going to be looking at two today with only one premise. This is one of the two. If you know that P and Q is true as a statement, right? What could follow from that? What necessarily follows from that? Well, perform the opposite operation from last time. So let's say this says, I went to her house and we stayed up all night talking. If you were to break that down into distinct claims, you would say, therefore P. Or you could say, therefore Q. Right? She interviewed him and she asked a lot of loaded questions. She interviewed him, right? She interviewed him and asked a lot of loaded questions. She asked a lot of loaded questions. You're saying if the two variables are both true in a conjunctive statement, then each of them have to be true on their own in like a simplified statement where it's only the one and not the other. And so you have options here, right? It could be P or it could be Q, but either way, they necessarily follow, right? You can't imagine that if the statement, I went to her house and stayed up all night, is true, then the statement, I went to her house, was false, right? Or that we stayed up all night was false. It just wouldn't work like that. And that's what I think I said already. This one is called simplification, right? Or simp for short. Let's use another example. We went to the movies and we ate a lot of popcorn. So therefore, the claim we went to the movies must follow from that. Or the statement we ate popcorn must follow from that, right? So it can appear in two different ways, but it means the same thing. That's it for simplification. And again, you've kind of, if you've been breaking down complex statements into distinct claims, like on some of the homework, I'll say, oh, you conflated two distinct claims here. It's because you didn't simplify them. Or if you effectively saw a sentence where there was an and you broke it into two distinct claims, you did engage in a kind of simplification there. So hopefully that connection helps you contextualize this. And the last form we're going to look at for today is the weirdest one. I say it's the weirdest one because you may think it's confusing, but beyond that, even when you know it makes sense and is right, a lot of people are like, wait, but why would I do that? Like, why would I ever use that? And I don't want to address that question because we can get into other stuff there, talking about like mathematical proofs and stuff like that. But just know that it is a valid argument form, and I will explain why. All right, so let's say P is the case. Only premise. What follows from that? Now you might say something like not P. True, but that's kind of just saying the same thing. Well, think about, again, the types of claims we looked at. Think about the types of claims we looked at. Conjunctions, hypothetical statements, or rather conditional statements, and disjunctions. Remember what a disjunction was? That was an either-or statement. And at the time we learned it, when we were talking about the different ways of conceiving a disjunctive syllogism, we talked about the exclusive or. This proof kind of requires you to take the more inclusive use of the word or. I'm going to explain why in a second, but the thing that follows is, if P is the case, right, then we must necessarily conclude that P or Q necessarily follows. If a thing is true, then a disjunctive statement involving that thing must also be true, must be the case. So what would this look, and again, I'm sorry you can't see this, this says P, this says P or Q. What would be an example of this? I am teaching a logic class right now. Let's say that claim is true. Therefore, the claim, either I am teaching a logic class right now, or I am eating a bag of chips, is a true claim, right? Because in a disjunction, the thing that makes it true is that at least one of the variables is true. So that condition is satisfied there. And it kind of gets outlandish, right? I am Anthony Seeley. Therefore, either I am Anthony Seeley or I am Marilyn Monroe. Right? It sounds weird, but it is logically correct given the definition of what a disjunction is and given the definition of what validity is. So if a variable is asserted and is true, then it would necessarily deductively follow that a disjunctive statement involving that thing was true. And that's the weirdest one. But I think when you get past the kind of practical weirdness of it, for our purposes, then it's relatively simple. Another way to remember these last two, they're the only ones with one premise, right? Everything else had two premises. Constructive Dilemma had three premises, but these guys, this one and Simplification, each had one premise. So that's kind of a little, what do they call that? Heuristic, or one of the, I forget the word for it, to help you remember those kind of things. That's it for the valid argument forms. So far we've done 8. That's all we're going to do. In the next lesson, we're going to look at 2 invalid argument forms, or in other words, 2 forms where regardless of the content, the conclusion does not follow. We could say they're formal fallacies, and that's what we'll talk about next class. As always, if you have any questions, Send an email, reach out, sign up for office hours. See you around.